October 2023. Jessica, take roll. Present.
Jumping here. Alfredo Moreno.
We're
Barbie Minor.
Here.
Please step up, like.
Here.
all right. District value is Thomas.
Thomas is with us. I believe he can hear us. We're trying to get him
Hello,
on camera.
everyone.
There we go.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see all, well, some of you.
Thomas, can you try turning your camera on again? See if it lets you do that now.
I have tried multiple times to turn my camera on and it won't let me.
Could you try one more time for me?
I am trying. It says to hit Control Shift plus O, and I'm doing that and it's not doing a thing. When I tried this earlier in the day, it worked fine, but it's not allowing me now.
Well, through the letter T, Michael is a golden person here. I believe it's you. So, we're gonna open up, pending possibly seeing Thomas, assuming this is Thomas, we will, open up the discussion with our district values.
All right, ready to begin?
Yes.
Great. So these are values that you have followed and reaffirmed as a board for the last several years. And your values, as you've discussed in the past, are meant to be sustained over a period of time and not change frequently. That doesn't mean they can never change. But you have chosen these three things to lead with equity, including all dimensions of equity, but within that to give special attention to disparities that are based around race and racial equity. The second value is environmental stewardship across the organization, administratively, in your budgeting, in your practices, in your programming, in your maintenance of your facilities and your land. And then the third is your continued commitment to community vision. So you spent a lot of time and a lot of energy engaging many people in the community, and you said, we want to honor that work and the 4 visioning goals that came out of that work. So we wanted just to remind you that these are the values that you have been operating under. Just because something isn't listed as a value doesn't necessarily mean that you're not also doing it or paying attention to it. But these were the things that you really wanted to raise to the top of the list. And we wanted to ask you to reaffirm these, or if you have questions or discussion about any of these three things, we'd love to hear it.
Great, well, I will turn to my peers first, see if anyone has any open thoughts, especially you, Miles, not to put you in the hot seat, but first time you've really been kind of working and reviewing these, so I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, and anybody else. Doesn't have to be Miles, sorry.
Okay. I'm still good with our values, so I don't have any changes or anything that jump at me.
I feel the same. Although I'm not trying to put you in the hot seat, I did just want to ensure that Miles, your POV is heard, just simply because welcoming you here.
Yeah, absolutely. These are, I think, values that take the whole district into account in what we need to do to better serve the community that we've been put in this place to do so. So it really connects with me. I think specifically with the commitment to community vision, that is a piece that I am really excited about joining in this particular value because of the importance of getting community voice involved in everything that we do.
Anyone here?
Great.
Thumbs up. And, yeah, nothing for me. I think I'll just reaffirm, I think the special attention of racial equity still is apt, in that first section. I know that was one we kind of, had some discussion about a year or two ago. And, everything else feels like it's, still very appropriate and relevant.
Fantastic, fantastic. Has anyone not spoken to these?
I think we got pretty good consensus.
Fantastic. Mr. Chair and Doug, is consensus all you needed, or did you need an affirmative vote?
Just consensus at this point.
Fantastic. All right. So then the next thing was we wanted to take a look at your budget priorities, if we could move to that. The budget priorities, as you've adopted them in the past, have been broad, overreaching themes that provide direction to your staff as they go about the business of developing a draft budget to bring to you. And like values, just because something isn't listed as a budget priority doesn't necessarily mean nothing is happening with it or nobody's doing anything with it. But these are the broad prioritized frameworks that you've directed your staff to budget within. And the first one is to really focus on your people. And not just your people, but the technology that they need to be successful. The second has been to focus on strengthening program opportunities. And for a while, you were really coming back from the pandemic and all of the changes and the staffing challenges and the reductions that COVID created. Now you are hopefully, if not completely beyond that, well on your way beyond that. So you see that specific reference to pandemic has been offered as edited out. And this is really a restatement of your commitment to breaking down barriers, to making sure that underserved and marginalized people are accessing what you provide, and including free programming in your community events work and the financial assistance that you provide. The third budget priority has been really to focus on the financial model of the district and making sure that it's sustainable, that you are pursuing all revenue streams that you can pursue, and that you're not just paying the bills today, but you're ensuring that future boards, future generations of users have a THPRD that is financially solid. And you will see that there is this edit proposed that you're going to actively pursue opportunities to expand and diversify your revenue streams, which I think is just an encapsulation of something that you've been wanting to do, but during COVID, it was more kind of surviving and just getting it through. And now you want to do an even more proactive job of that. So we wanted to ask you to weigh in on these three budget priorities and whether you will affirm them again going forward, or if you have any questions or have others you wanted to propose instead.
Thank you. Thoughts? We have Felicitas.
Hi, Thomas. Yeah, I think these are still the three right ones. I'm particularly, I guess, going to champion for invest in employees. I think over the last year, we've seen that our employees have other options. So what does it mean to think thoughtfully about ensuring that they stay, they're happy? I mean, when we think about our greatest asset, it's our employees. So, and then I also just want to call out the last sentence, which I do like, that we will actively pursue opportunities to expand and diversify revenue streams. I want to make, and I know this is going to happen, but I'm just going to say it out loud, that when we look at budget priorities, that we're also keeping in mind our values, because we can decide we're going to charge for something, but how does that impact low income families? So I believe all 6 of these, which I know our amazing staff will do. So, but I just have to say that loud because that's their job. Thank you.
I can jump in. Concur, I think I've seen, the one that stands out for me is the final red line. Actively pursue opportunities to expand and diversify revenue streams. I joined the board kind of while in the heart of the pandemic recovery. So I'm glad to see that we're in a position where we can, if that has been an idea that's been on the table in the past, that we can lean harder into that. So I think it's extremely appropriate now as we have made investments in employees and technology and other things that environmental stewardship that has a price tag with it and is worthy of investment, but we have to be able to get the revenue streams broadened. So I really appreciate seeing that and look forward to seeing what that looks like.
Others of you who haven't spoken to these yet?
I'll jump in. More of just a provocative question, not saying that I disagree with what's up here. I think I'm struggling a bit with the timing of said levy and what we're doing, and that we're listing a budget priority of free programming. And I recognize I'm an advocate for breaking down said barriers and ensuring that we have access for everyone. I'm just challenging us to if we're doing these in tandem at the same time. I get hung up a little bit on that because I feel like a little bit of conflicting messages that we are in a deficit situation that we need to address, and we're saying we're going to pursue other revenue streams, and yet at the same time we're also saying how can we continue to do things that are supplemental to ensure we have access. And I'm sure it's a fine balance, but I just wanted to raise that feels a little bit of a tension for me.
I think to continue off that, where my mind goes a little bit as well is thinking about the grant space. I know that we are doing some great work with that now that we have a team that is all put together. And I just want to put, I guess, a emphasis on a continued support of that work to help offset some of these costs that we may need to see come in to diversify our revenue streams.
Tia, do you have any thoughts on this? Not just the question Barbie raised, but any of the 3.
Well, I think it's all very timely. I think last year we focused on making sure that where we are with taking care of our employees with the comp plan and all of that kind of stuff. So now we're informed on how we can take care of our employees and where we're at. And so I think it's very timely that, we're informed and we're setting up for potentially this levy and budget priorities for should we not have the levy or should we have the levy? So, and keeping our employees and technology in the forefront is really good. I think the next one with programming is super important. I get what Barbie's saying about the free programming. I push back a little bit because, maybe a different word is needed, but I don't think it's necessarily free because our community members are paying taxes and everything. So it's not like they haven't paid their share. There's just accessible things that bring our communities together. And so that's what I think when I think free programming is basically we're creating spaces for people to come together. And I don't necessarily think it's free in that people have paid for it. There's no extra cost for it. And so, so I don't know if free doesn't need to be in capital letters like that maybe, but, or if there's another way, but I think continuing to create opportunities so that everyone is able to enjoy something in the park districts that their taxes are going to is very important. But if we have things that are, on top of, all of our other things and opportunities that, like are extra, like wine and yoga, like that definitely should not be free. So I think there's a balance, definitely. So yeah, that's just my opinion. But I think these proposed budget priorities are, I was actually thinking like how different we were last year, but it's still like so relevant this year, and probably even more so than it was last year. So I'm good with the changes and how everything is spelled out. Maybe not capitalized free.
Barbie, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please. No.
Barbie, as you listen to others on the board kind of think through their response to your comment, how does it sit with you?
I'm amenable for sure. This might be a wordsmithing thing. It might be just like you said, maybe it's not all caps and then I won't just see the same thing at the same time. I'm asking, like, we've got other issues, but.
I think it's a really good question though, Barbie. And I think one of the things that we'll have to continually work through is how can we, for us to be the park district that we want to be, considering our values, considering our pretty ambitious goals, like we've been told pretty directly, we need more money. And I think knowing the values of this board, like every step of the way, we're gonna have really critical questions and struggle, but we also know that this potential money will allow us to keep doing these things. But I think we have to keep holding both because they're both critical. We have to ask critical questions of how this work aligns with our values, including access and programming. And like, to me, free programming includes the fact that I can go to the nature park for free. I can't go to a gymnastics class for free, but there's reasons why we do that. So anyways, I think it's a great question, Barbie. Keep asking those questions.
I think it's kind of like like a three-legged camp stool kind of thing, right? If you want to invest in employees and technology, I'm sorry, if you want to strengthen programming, you have to have good employees and technology, but in order to have all of the above, you have to have sustainable operating and financial models to pay for it. So they are in alignment to me. We want to have one of, if not the best, park and rec special district in the state of Oregon. We already are there. It requires us to continue to fund it, or else it will not be there. So I think that is, we have kind of lofty ambitions as a board, as a staff. So I think these are all in alignment for me that we have to continue to find ways to give the community what they really appreciate and what they like and what they utilize. So these feel good, but they're great questions to kind of, just to think through how to do 1, 2, and just 3 go in the face of that or power it. And so that's where I'm at with it. Anybody else, or back to you, Thomas?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I hear, both of which I think are just fantastic. One is the idea that your values and your budget priorities, while they're on separate pages and we're discussing them as if they are separate things, they are linked together. And that as you pursue your budget priorities or direct staff to, that doing that through the lens of your values is always your intention. So I think to have identified that's just a great thing. I think also the idea that free may or may not need to be in all caps, or free doesn't necessarily mean unfunded. Something that is free and to the public could still be funded or underwritten in some other way, either taxes or grant or something. But I think it's astute of you to point out that you just want to make sure as you enter this levy discussion that you're being thoughtful anytime you talk about free. So I think you're being really thoughtful about this. So Mr. Chair, does this require a vote, or is this a consensus affirmation of these?
I think we're going to a consensus again on this one.
Fantastic. All right. Are we ready to move on to the next portion of our discussion? All right. So Mr. General Manager, team, do you and your team want to walk your board through this portion, or do you want me to walk your board through this portion?
So we are all set. We're going to give you a little list at this point because you have some work coming up for sure. So I'm always going to lead this off, and I think based on the discussion with regard to free programming, it's really some nice insight because Holly can actually speak into that as part of the survey work and part of that decision making that should things go the wrong way in May, we need to be ready to make cuts, and that's part of the discussion we can have this evening.
Yeah, so much. First off, I just want to start with an apology because some of this information might feel redundant if you were at the Joint Advisory Committee meeting. And we're also going to go over some of this at your next board meeting as well. So it will be a little bit of a repeat. But just as a reminder, you all have appointed 13 really thoughtful, amazing people to the Levy Task Force. I just want to share with y'all, you did an amazing job because they truly reflect the community. We had everyone go around the room at the first meeting to talk about their connection with THPRD, what services they use. We had folks who said the STIR Center is my lifeline, it is my place. We have a high school student on there who talked about the programming. We have parents on there who have kids in preschool programs, who have kids in after school programs. We have people who said your trails saved my life during the pandemic. I would have lost my mind if I hadn't had the trails to go walk on. And we have people who have known us for years, including Margaret Robinson, whose mom was our 4th board member in history and who had Elsie Stir at her kitchen table, planning and dreaming to form the district from 53 to 55. That's where they were meeting in the Robinson house and planning away. So we felt that energy and that love from our origin story. So the task force has been wrestling with 3 questions on your behalf. Should we go for an operating levy? If so, what should the size, scope, and scale of that operating levy be? And when should we go? So you've got, should we do it? What's the amount? What's the scope? And what's the timing? Those are the 3 questions. I also want to divert for just a second to talk about Barbie, I loved your question and I really appreciated that discussion. And if you remember when we started back in March and April, just even talking about the levy concept, right? We had some slides where we talked about all the way through this process, we need to be thinking about how to offset our impacts, right? What is the harm of going for a levy? Who will be impacted for it? And how do we offset those impacts? And thinking about those that are most financially strained in our community and thinking about the financially vulnerable and passing forward the cost increase potentially of additional property tax is forefront in our minds. And remember, we talked about how we've been able to expand our financial aid program, expand access to it, increase literally the dollar amounts and the flexibility even through times of restraint. So we know that 2 things are possible. And one of the things our levy task force members have talked about is how important the levy actually is to fund and enable our subsidized programming. So, wearing my communications hat, I'd never use a word like subsidy, right? Like there's a reason we say free in all caps, because it's a signal to our staff who are so used to like that free programming, meaning free of charge, no cost to get into. Because our rec staff, they're wired, right? They know that those program budgets have to make revenue. So it's a really kind of internal coding issue for us that really matters. But the key of it is that the subsidization through property taxes that enable that subsidized programming, AKA free, is what allows us to do it. So we really will be intentional as we move forward with a successful levy to expand financial aid. You're going to see some additional money requests for financial aid and showing how we make that connection. So that was really on point with our planning. So On the next slide, I want to share with you a little bit of a recap of the public opinion survey work that we've done. So we surveyed 600 highly likely voters. These are people who are very likely to vote in the potentially May 2024 election based on their voting history. And this is some of the highlights from what we heard. First and foremost, y'all should be really, really proud of the district that 76% of people that we serve are satisfied with our services. That is incredibly high. For context, typically local governments, thinking cities and counties, they're sitting usually in the mid 50s to the mid 60s range. Getting a 76 in this day and age with the public with kind of low trust in government, low trust in institutions, and the feels people have, these are outstanding numbers and say that our public has a lot of trust. 3 out of 4 people in this community are satisfied with their services. The second point we want to emphasize is that an almost equal number, the first number was 76, this number is 75, folks have no clue there's a funding shortfall. They are not seeing it. They don't know it. They don't know that it's happening. So this really leans into the need for the public information campaign and how much work we have to do over the next few months to make our case and let people know about that funding shortfall. Now, I've heard a lot of angst out there, like, oh, are things too good? Are our services too good? Do we need to look like our park services partner agency to the east where things aren't kept up as nice for people to understand investing in facilities and investing in stuff is important? I don't think we need to. I think what we need to do is make the case and let people understand about the hole in the budget, what that hole funds, what the potential investment in the levy will preserve. And preservation is the key word there, preserving existing service levels. So people just simply aren't aware. Now, the good news is we asked them many times through the survey about how they feel, and we could measure as we went through the survey. Once they were informed and made aware, not just that there is a funding shortfall, but had greater explanation and information about the depth of the shortfall, about what would have to be cut to fill the gap, people then became, oh, this is important. This is a big deal. Got to pay attention. And 60% of the likely voters ultimately said they would support a levy. Now, that is an important confidence number. With that 60%, that says to us we're in a position to move forward, but we can't be lazy. We can't sit back. We really have to invest in that public information campaign and do our best to make sure that people understand how big that funding gap is and what service cuts could be impacted, right? If we don't fill that gap. That's a really important point. We also learned that people, what arguments people most gravitated to. So we tested in different orders, different reasons why you might be compelled to select to invest in this levy. And the top issues that really resonated with the public were centered in our park services and our maintenance. Lots of concern over reductions in garbage collection, lots of concerns over rollbacks in maintenance, over reductions in restroom cleaning. Julie, Rocha, and Emily Kent and I were in a meeting with some folks last week, and we went over a couple of these points. And literally, I got the words reduce garbage collection out of my mouth, and a lady in the room screamed, "No!" And then there were a lot of like visual descriptions of other community parks that she's seen in other places, and a visual image going, "No, we can't let that happen." So really proved out what we saw in the polling. Those things really matter. Also, after school programming, people understanding after school programming could potentially not be available to be offered anymore, really impacted. Same room, and I will admit it was all seniors, got the same scream on the after school programming. So really proved out in that space. There were interesting nuances, like after school program, really important to the public, preschool programs, less important to the public. Again, these are matters of degree and nuance. What this information tells us is what information do we emphasize in our communication efforts. So if I've got space for 3 or 4 bullets, these are the topics you're going to see all the time. I can tell you, it's already happened to me today. People are looking at materials and going, what about this? What about that? Aren't you going to add this point? Aren't you going to add? No, we're going to focus on those core messages. It's better to focus on your core messaging than inundate people with a laundry list. They then feel overwhelmed. So on the next slide, just a little bit of a preview of the timeline and where we're headed. The Levy Task Force is going to have their final meeting on November 15th. We asked them at the end of their second meeting how they felt, if they felt that they needed another meeting, needed more information, or if they would be ready to dig into those questions. And they uniformly said, we're ready to dig deep into those questions. And in fact, I can tell you the questions that they had for us really centered on, is 50 cents enough? Are you sure? Can we see your assumption year over year about how that's going to hold up? Got lots of questions on how you lived without a levy this long. We want to understand that. And lots of questions, honestly, about making sure that we're keeping the operational needs of the district kept up with the bond program and with the physical expansion of the district. So really astute there to make sure that we're doing a good job scaling up our operations to maintain what we have over time. So where we're headed is they will have their final meeting in November. We expect to get them to vote on their formal recommendations, the answers to those 3 questions. We will then, at your December board meeting, have a few of the task force members come to that meeting and present to you in person. So you will be hearing from them, not me, about their experience on the task force and their recommendations. All of this preparing you hopefully for January, where you will have the opportunity to discuss and decide as a board what you want to do. If you want to refer a levy to the voters. Paperwork is due to the county in March, and the next possible election cycle that we could participate in would be in May of 2024. Okay, so any questions? Yeah.
A quick one. Does the task force recommend a levy and date, or just their thoughts on the levy?
We asked them specifically 3 questions. So should we do a levy, size and scope, and then the time frame? So we are going to ask them the time frame.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And, you know, they have asked questions, May versus November, why. We've talked pros and cons and gone back and forth. So you'll have that recommendation from them. Okay, so on the next slide, what we want to do is engage y'all. And oh, Thomas, I just saw you on video. Hi, Thomas. Yay. Okay, so we want to engage you all in a discussion of future planning. And part of this is coming up. Like if you were at the Joint Advisory Committee, you saw me get asked some of these questions, which are kind of awkward, right? Like I don't ever want to be ahead of the board of directors and answering questions from, you know, the public. It's like, where's my magic 8-ball? I don't know what's going to happen. But some of the questions that the public is asking are the same questions our staff are asking, and what we need to think about to be prepared to present our next year's budget and to get going on our planning for that. And so that is what will happen. We need to figure out what will happen if the levy passes and what will happen if the levy doesn't pass, right? We need to plan for both scenarios. So Jared and the management team have discussed this issue several times, and our recommendation at this point is that we will plan for a full budget year, assuming that the levy has passed. And that within that, we will also plan for essentially what we did during our COVID years of a revised operating plan scenario, where we will also plan the first year showing if the levy didn't pass, what would the budget look like for this year? So
is it your gut check that the task force will be recommending a May 2025?
My 24. Yeah, it's at this
I
point,
was paying attention, good job.
at this point, my assumption based on their discussions is May of 2024. They have not discussed 25. They've asked about May versus November. And we have explained why we think May is better for the district and for planning purposes. And there has been nothing but support for that. So I can't get ahead of their recommendation. I suspect based on their conversation, it'll absolutely be 2024. And I think they're leaning towards May as well.
And I get that we have to be writing the budget now. So I'm just trying to make sure.
Yeah, well, and I have to give lots of credit to the management team collectively because this was a really hard thing to wrap my brain around until, and I think it might have been Aisha or Jared, somebody said the words, treat it like a revised operating plan. And then all of a sudden that really clicked because as managers, that's what we've been living on for the last 3 years is trying to plan a budget based on what we think is going to happen, but then being really, really careful managing our expenses as we're going through and paying attention to the details and really thinking ahead quarter by quarter, what would reductions look like if we're living within reduced revenues? And what's actually on our side is in the scenario we've been in for the last several years, we didn't know our actuals until we were moving through it versus if this were to happen, we know what reality is, so we could really slide into a revised operating plan right away, much more elegantly than we could during the COVID years, if that makes sense. Okay, so in thinking about those questions, the first question, and we got this at Joint Advisory Committee, is if you go out for a levy, and if the levy is not successful, what do? Are you done? Or are you willing to consider a levy again? So that is kind of the first question that we've already gotten from the public, and we'd like you all to sort of think about and noodle. What I can tell you is based on my experience and working on historically campaigns over time, there is definitely a percentage. There's definitely a number, right? So sometimes your first effort at a campaign is a really great foundation to build to success. So by way of example, like when I worked for the city of Beaverton, we went out for a bond to ask for funds to build a public safety building. It was not successful the first time, but it lost by less than 2 points. And we were able to use that foundation to turn around and go at a next election cycle where we were successful. And it really was the foundation that we had built. And so that is something for you to consider. Would you be comfortable thinking about, if it is not successful that first time, but we're close, say 45% or higher, would we be willing to sharpen our pencils and make that effort again? First question to consider. And then the second question is, if the levy isn't successful, what will be our budgeting philosophy, right? So we have talked about what that $16 million gap is. That $16 million gap is about less than 5 years away. And we know year over year, that gap is smaller. And so it would be one of a philosophical question. If we're going to have to reduce budgets, what should our reduction philosophy be? Do we want to try to cut the full 16 million? It won't be necessary, probably not a good idea. Do we want to cut 1.6 million because we know that's the gap that first year? Jared's done some projections for us. That looks really goofy. So he's shown us, when we've got charts to show and share with you, what a scaling of that reduction could look like, right? So if we took, for example, the first year, a 10% cut, it really smooths us out across the board and evens those cuts out over time. It gives us more time to prepare. So those are kind of the topics that we want you all to think about. Would you be willing to consider levy again in the future if it's close? And what do we want our reduction philosophy to be going into planning a cut budget? if we're unsuccessful with the levy.
Question. I don't have any sense of what the robust communications plan, what strategies 360 is costing us. So I think that would really shape my thoughts on number one. But I will say that if we got close, I think Holly is right. We will have laid a foundation. And so it probably would make sense to go back. And the thing that's stressing me out the most is I know everything that's coming on the ballot in 2024. Like, this might be the thickest voters pamphlet statement we've had in a really long time. And so what does it mean to, like, we know people will turn out, which is great. We want that. But it also means that there's just so much information that people are getting. And so how and will we stand out is my biggest concern.
I think that was my first question too, is if we were to not pass it, like what is the cost for running it again? I feel like it would be cheaper because we've done a lot of this stuff already, but as far as like getting information and stuff like that. The other, I guess my budget philosophy kind of depends on how close we are, because I would almost say that I would want to run, if we were to lose, I would almost want to run our budget at what it would eventually be. And so really the public would see the vast disparity before the 2025, if we were going to go again. So it kind of depends on, they kind of go interchange together. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that, and I will defer to my friends in rec division on some of these. Some of the cuts are going to be much more easy to scale and will make a lot more sense. Some won't. So if we were to do something like try to eliminate after school programming, like that would be a devastating thing to do, because you've got families that are relying on it. You've got returning customers essentially that have been relying on it. You've got the staffing, to dismantle that and then try to build it back up in a year or two if the levy were to pass the second time. So we've had some tactical conversations that scaling and not going to the full cuts would make a lot more sense for the management of the district. And you've really got to look at it issue by issue, because you can reduce cleanings, you can reduce services, you can reduce garbage collection, those things a lot easier than eliminating some of these programs that then would be really hard to build back up.
Yeah. And when you say after school programming, are you just talking about aftercare, or are you talking about all of our like art classes and stuff? Like
It's the Thrive program.
Right.
It's the
Not
Thrive
like
after school.
basketball after, like all of those? Okay.
Other thoughts, Barbie?
Yeah. Timing question. Is there data that shows, and would it even be an option to come back in November, or would we need to wait a full next year?
We can do whatever we want. So we would not have to wait. You could say we didn't make it in May, we're going to try in November. You could say we didn't make it in May, we're going to try it May of the next year. So you would have flexibility there for what you're deciding.
In stereo, Holly.
The way I sound. And Felisa, I want to answer your question. We're spending $3,000 a month right now in advice and services. The most expensive part of our assistance was the polling, and I forgot offhand what that was. I have to tell you, I've done this multiple ways, and I've seen public agencies do this multiple ways. The second time through is never as much as the first, because you've already done the polling work, you've already done your robust communications, and you have internal people doing a lot of the execution. So the second time through, I can get you some estimates on that, but the second time through, much more.
I'm even thinking about all the data you'll have after an election. That'll be really helpful. But hopefully we don't have to go out a second time. Can I, sorry, I'm just thinking about in terms of reduction philosophy. I appreciate what you were sharing about kind of infrastructure, because since we received this in advance, I sat down and kind of thought about, okay, what can I stand next to and say, like, we can cut this? And like, when I think about maintenance, I think about safety and like rats, right? I mean, just like, how do we keep things clean? Like that public health matters. But then, and not to say community events don't lead to public health. I mean, I'm mindful of that, but thinking about the infrastructure and like canceling or not having, truck day 1 year. I know everyone loves truck day. Is different than other cuts, right? So I guess to me, as painful as it is, I jump towards community events where the infrastructure wouldn't disappear overnight. Like cutting after school, I mean, you're 100% right. That would impact so many people's daily lives. So I think to sort of answer your question, I sort of like what Tia's saying, but I get it. So I think, I don't know if I'm helping.
Time, and you're honestly conveying kind of where we landed, where it's like there's three options. You could cut to what you just need to for the year. You could go the full extreme and try to cut the full amount, or you could go somewhere in the middle that tries to balance, Tia, what you're saying about you have to show people the impact of the choice. You've got to show people a change in service delivery. So that's absolutely true. But you want those changes to not impact your scalability and your ability to preserve programming if we were to be successful the second time, which is why, you know, Jared kind of focused on that more 10% cut in year one, because it allows us to look at things like, you know, holding on open positions. So as we know that people leave the agency, we could sit on unfilled positions. That doesn't mean we'll sit on everyone, you know, like if we were to, I don't know, I'll pick Clint. You know, if we didn't have an IT manager, we'd need to replace an IT manager. Please don't leave. But you know what I'm saying? There are positions that we may have to fill, but we can think more critically about unfilled positions. We can have some targeted reductions in park services. We can have some closures of amenities. So maybe the splash pads that we're talking about. So there's a real impact there and a reduction in expense.
So a revised budget would be 10% less.
I kind of feel like number 1 and 2 are, well, I feel like 1's a little more of a simple, is kind of I would imagine you're looking for a consensus here and just maybe some thoughts. 2 feels like a much deeper, more complicated dive. So maybe if we can kind of get a little closure on number 1, that would help. We've heard some, do you have anything, Miles, for number 1?
I'm in agreement about like I would say that unless it's completely defeated and abysmal, like we do it again. If it's near this kind of like 45% mark, I would have a margin of error of even like 5% or so there too. Like 40, I would be comfortable with running again too. I think it would be important to get it to the district. Also, I'd be really interested to hear what the task force thinks about if they recommend May and it gets defeated, what they think about it going again in November.
Ask them.
Others do a share on number 1.
I will just, on the record, I'm in agreement as well. I think what gets me there about going again is see Exhibit A back 2 slides where it said 75% don't know that we're in this position. And so I think half of this is, again, we've got to do messaging. So it's like, you got to tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them, kind of a thing. And so in that regard, I too would say we got to go again if we're that close.
Alfredo, do you have a view on this yourself as chair?
I need to, you know, with this, but you know, it's a sports fan, right? I'm a sports guy. You know, I see this honestly as a if the committee were to recommend May of 2024, 76% of the people are satisfied. I mean, the district is ahead of the favorite. I mean, based on you know, this community and what it shows its values to be at the ballot box. But that puts pressure on staff and on board alike to make sure the story is told that, some people won't care how we got here and needing this. Some people, that's the main thing they want to know. Some people just want to know what's going to be at risk if it's not a yes, and agree completely how we were going with this, with hanging your hat on 3 hooks, and but I kind of, not in a menacing way, but in a like, it's our duty way to, if this is the recommendation, to bring this thing home in the way it should be brought home. So my answer is yes, I agree with the staff recommendation, 45 plus. There's a part of me, it's just like, if it's 45%, if it's as low as 45%, I want to know what went wrong. So, honest, I was like, 48%. So, but I think it's just articulating that story in the way that people say it's a no-brainer. And so that's on me, that's on all of us, that's on the staff and everyone who is going to be active in this. So, that was my thoughts, but that's where I wanted to kind of share that I just think if we do the work the way I think we do the work, while it's our job to consider all the scenarios, I really feel like we should be able to do this at 45, yes, is what I'm trying to go at. But yes, I want it to happen.
I also would say that speaking to articulating like why we need it, or just like what the point of the levy is in general, I would love for us to, in the communications, talk about like what those cuts would look like and the reductions and everything, so that we don't have to have that conversation if it fails for folks, so that it is something upfront. And like how we can communicate that in a way that's not like a spooky story, I think is really a great question that I don't know the answer to. But it's all you. I think that is just something that I think is going to be really important.
Miles, you're right in with the polling, because one of the lessons from the polling is that like people really responded that they cared, for example, about the job cuts. We talked about the reductions in staffing, but it framed so much better when we connected that with the services those staff provide. So to your point, it's important that we don't just talk about losing people. We need to talk about what those people do and how they serve the community. And then people really make that connection and understand. So, intrinsically, they do care about protecting jobs, but they really care when they understand you're talking about, oh, my aquatics instructor, oh, the person cleaning my park. Oh, I get it. That's really important.
And I think real quick before, just to close my thought, which trail off inarticulately at the end there, but I think I was trying to sum up is just that, like, while I see this as a something that we should be favored to pass, I think that being in that position puts even more onus on us to make sure everything is tightened and polished, and to do the things that we're doing. So to not operate the assumption that it will because of the history of voters in this community, but to ensure that they have all the information, everything that they need to know that makes it an obvious yes for them. So that's where I was putting the pressure on all of us to like really make sure there's no screw that's loosened or untightened. So up to you.
I think actually somewhat related is that, and it sounds like you're presenting this again or something like this at the next meeting. So, and maybe this is just something to prepare for the next meeting, of very, very clear expectations on us, because while this is happening, it's also budget season and it's also short session, and we're all advocating for Cooper Mountain in our own ways. Like, so I'm already feeling stretched thin. So then thinking about more, it makes me a little nervous, right? And so I want to support this knowing like what's expected of me, because I know it's gonna take some work and I want it to pass, of course. So I just want us to be super clear on what the expectation is of us, so that we are, when we vote for or against this, like we are doing it fully informed. Thank you.
So I have a question and an observation. The first observation is, it sounds like, as of now, and this isn't binding and not an official vote, and it doesn't commit you to this, but it sounds like there's a general consensus around that first question that if the levy comes close to passing, but doesn't fully pass, that you are amenable, depending on the percentage that it loses and what the committee recommends, that you are amenable to the concept of going back out again. And whether that's in a year, whether that's in November, all of that has yet to be determined. Am I hearing that consensus?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Right. The second, just kind of a comment, and I say this not because you don't know this, but when you talk about the onus being on all of you, staff and board, as you all know, your staff can certainly provide information. They can answer questions, but you can advocate for the levy in a way that they cannot. So they can only go so far in providing the public information about what if and what if not, which is super important, but they can't go beyond that and actually lobby the public, advocate with the public to vote yes. You can. So as long as you just remember that, it may seem like a distinction without a difference, but it is an important difference just to remember, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification, for sure.
Here is the next question. And again, it's not like tonight you are committing yourself to a particular reduction strategy in stone. But there are two questions that have been raised. What do you think about the scaled reduction approach that Holly has mentioned, which is don't cut nothing, don't try to cut 16 million, but maybe you start with 10%. What do you think about that as just kind of general direction for your staff at this time?
So if we were to not have the levy pass, like ever, what percentage would we have to function right now? Do we have a percentage number of our budget,
To pop up those slides.
or can we say?
Just. Walk through and explain.
Yeah, I think I would like to. So Tia, I definitely appreciate your question. When I first did a couple scenarios, I first showed it to Aisha, and Aisha said, okay, you need to show Doug before this goes to management team so he's aware. And I was talking with Doug about it, and one of the ones that I did prepare that I didn't bring tonight was a 10-year scenario. And a 10-year scenario, I looked at it as what do we need to cut now or in the next 2 years in order to ensure that our revenue sources can fund the next 10 years worth. And that was ultimately a 15% cut for 25 and a 10% cut for 26. There were significant cuts.
15% cut for the 2025 year.
Yes.
And then what?
And then 10% more in 26. And that
Would
would
that make around 17% from now?
I didn't look at it as a 1-year cut.
Okay.
And so I can't tell you that answer.
Yeah.
But that would provide us with revenue that build reserves in the first several years, first 5 years or so.
Okay.
And then would utilize those reserves over the next. And then it's pushing that fiscal cliff out 10 years.
Okay.
We decided not to bring that. So we did bring this. as well as another slide. So this one is a 2-year scenario that would allow us to push that cliff out 5 years. Maybe I'll sit back a little bit. So it's a 10% cut, or just over 5 million, split between materials and services and personnel services in the first year. Then an additional 7.5% cut in 26, just under 4 million. That would allow us to go out 5 years before needing additional resources based on the operations we have today. The downfall with this is we can't cut 5 million from administration or from park services and hold our programs whole. So as soon as we start cutting programs, then we're losing more revenue. And our revenue streams aren't holding as we would need them to hold.
So you don't have to feel the weight of all of this right now. Kind of release that sadness, release that weight. And remember, you're not making decisions right now. You know, we're just in this point where we've got to start gearing up to give managers direction. They've got to think about, how do I build my budget next year? So the first level direction is build it, assuming that we've got the levy, we've got that preservation budget. And then as we think about what that revised operating plan scenario looks like, what do we want that direction for them to be? Do we want it to be this 10%, 7.5% scenario? Do we want it to be huge cuts? Can't build back up from that. That's kind of the choice.
So if I'm understanding it right, to live for 5 more years at budget, we should be doing 15% this year. And you said 7.5%.
10% year one, 7.5
For this 5 year. He's recommended 10. That's less than what we would do if we're right going for the 5.
So going for the 5 years is 10% and then 7.5.
Okay. Gotcha.
It was the 10-year that was 15 and 10.
Gotcha. Okay. I like the 5 year because I feel like by the end of 5 years, even if we fail, in 5 years, people will be like, okay, I mean, assuming that our economy doesn't tank. I don't think it would take 10 years for people to reevaluate. So if that 10% is already on our path to 5 years, then I'm totally supportive of that. So, but I do, in preserving certain things, I don't know if this is the conversation, because like there's certain things that like, I know our swimming doesn't make that much money, but I want that preserved for safety of our community. So, and I don't know where that conversation of where our, because I know you said like, you have this much amount from, administrative and this much amount from, but I think all of us might have different priorities in that aspect, and you guys have your own different priorities. And I don't know when that conversation happens, because again, like I said, there's certain things that, I mean, you guys say Thrive would get cut, and then it sounds like from the community's perspective and from my perspective, that's something that would be like a non-cut, and we would cut something else out. So that give and take conversation, I guess, when does that happen in terms of when we do if we move forward with the 10%? Because you guys might say we should shut a swimming center down, and my thing would be like, that should not be a cut thing.
Can I also get clarity? I think I'm getting really stuck on the 5 versus 10. What is?
This budget, the minus, if we decrease 10% this year and 7.5% the next year, that'll keep us alive for 5 years before we run into financial problems again. But the other one that they were talking about would keep us alive for 10 years. And that's the one they didn't present. Thank you. You're welcome.
If I could, I think if for the savings purposes, stick to the bulleted outline and get reactions from the boards on those, then at a future date, we can drop down. You get more specific, because it's obviously it's much more detailed from there, but with these directives here in terms of priorities, or, no, we would want to see X bullet, drop it off the list. Or we would like to add a bullet. That will help us a good deal to get initially launched and get to a level where we can start talking specificity.
Right. So, yeah, what we're sort of looking for is what levers do we feel are appropriate to be available to be pulled in a reduction scenario? What levers do you want to see added? What levers do you want off the table at this point, at this early hypothetical point? So starting with this kind of.
Yeah, and let me inject a reminder here. So you remember that as a board, your role is to govern and to provide policy direction to your staff, and that you don't run the district, your staff run the district. So you need to make sure that budget direction you provide your staff is not at a granular program by program, position by position level, but at a higher policy direction level. Now, it's reasonable to ask your staff, what would that mean? What would that look like? But you just want to be mindful of the difference between your role as a board and what your staff are charged to do.
Question. Does the task force know the difference between our operating budget and our SECs? Because when Felicia just talked about Cooper Mountain, I can only imagine somebody being like, you just spent $1 million to buy this. How could you afford that if you're asking me for more money? Is there, in that levy communication, do we differentiate between our SDC fees and our operating budget?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we spent the first meeting of the task force giving them a 101 on our budget. So we talked about where are all our revenue sources, where does our funding come from, where does it go? We acknowledged that we had other funding streams like SDCs that do other things, but we focused their attention on the operating budget. Like I said, they did get into a lot of discussion about operating versus acquisition. And they were really interested in our long-term planning to make sure that our thinking and planning about our operational needs and infrastructure was keeping up with our acquisition and our additional land purchases that we get. But they understood their focus was operating funds.
When you say, when it says production philosophy, so I personally, based on everything I've heard, I always reserve the right to change my mind if I get more information. But based on what I've heard, I like the 10%. I feel like that's a dent, but not a gash. So of course, I also think we're going to put a lot of our eggs in the levy basket, but we're not going to like 11 or 12. But it also makes sense for us to plan. So I like the 10%.
That is exactly the helpful information we need right now. And thank you for bringing it up to philosophy, because that is where we were trying to center it on, which is what should be the perspective, the approach, the lens we take to think about those cuts. And so having your wisdom being centered on this level, don't do the full deal, don't do the minimum, do enough to smooth it out. Agreeing to that range is incredibly helpful, and then allows us, as we're preparing the budgets, coming to you all in your role as budget committee, to explain what those changes might be and have that discussion about what those cuts are in our actual revised operating plans. As they're getting developed.
Are these bullets part of that 10%? Right? You're not just looking for 10% or thoughts on these bullets.
They were examples of how we would get to the 10%.
10%, right? Yeah. So thoughts on those, assuming it's the 10%, I'm also in agreement, just FYI, with the scenario of the 10%. It seems like the 5-year the 5-year plan seems to be good, but on the bullet side, is there thoughts on?
Yeah, I've got some
Yeah.
thoughts. The 5-year plan, I also agree with the 10% and then the 7.5. I think that's the best idea, especially if we are going to return to doing a levy again, trying to get it by if it fails. The other piece is looking at the bullets specifically. Thinking about jobs, people, positions, staffing. I would like to err away from targeted reductions in staffing. And maybe that's through doing the holding. Like I'd be okay with the holding if we have to do that, if it comes down to salaries that we need to be thinking about in this process. So I would like to not see people go that don't have to or shouldn't have to. But if there are positions that are open because of people leaving, I would feel more comfortable with that. But also understand the necessity of what we will have to do to maintain the district.
Barbie, have you spoken to this issue, either the 5-year, the
See
10-year
me come
plan?
off my mic and know that I was waiting to jump in. It's like jump rope. I too am moving with the 10% approach. I think from a philosophy point of view, I'm going to do my best to synthesize. I think it's so nuanced that what I'm hearing is it's a hodgepodge for me personally. All of the bullets you've listed, I think will show up in that 10%. I don't think that it's as easy as saying it's this one or it's over here. And we do then have to refer back to where our values lie. And I think it's a balance of our values alongside where does it make sense to blend this together. So I think, Holly, I just want to commend you because the way that you synthesized and came back to, hey, sorry to pick on you, Clint, but you know, there'll be some situations where it makes sense to hold. There's other situations when we talk about thrive where it's like, no. And so I would just hope that I hear you loud and clear that we stay up here and it's the expertise of the staff to come back of how that looks. But just knowing that I think you're hearing from us, we would like to have some viz into that and a philosophy of mitigating where it makes sense. And so it's not just as, I mean, a lame example of like, we were to just say you need to cut back on your breakfast budget, right? Like, does that include my Dutch Bros or not? You know, right? Where it's a little bit more of, I just think it's so nuanced and each of these has implications that continue to cascade that I think just tie back in. So forgive me if that wasn't my most articulate way of sharing, but I'm gonna guess, where's the all of the above would be my answer.
So it sounds like there's a general consensus that the 10% scenario followed by a 7.5% scenario in year 2 has general consensus among you as a board. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I was going to add. It was just that I agree with the comment that Lisa made earlier just about the park maintenance. And that's why I'm moving my bullet point targeted, which I would entrust that the staff would be taking a very strategic look on those things. I think there is some safety concerns and some with all of these in this unfortunate scenario, it would be, as we discussed earlier, what can be built back when things are more favorable, what parts of our reputation can be more easily improved upon when things are more favorable financially. So that's where I would, but that did land with me about the maintenance and having things that are unsafe for people to be on, you know, would be a concern. That's the only thing I can circle is I would be good with targeting reductions in services on park maintenance because I trust that the staff would not do that in a slapdash way that would just cut everything across the board and have some places that are really unsound and others that maybe just not quite as pristine as we like. So that's my 2 cents there.
Can I ask Doug a question? Doug, do you concur with Barbie's point that in order to get to 10% year 1, if needed, and another 7.5% in year 2, that it is likely that some combination of all these things or most of these things and maybe other things would be necessary to get to that 10% and eventually 17.5%.
Yes, I think they all have to stay in play. The emphasis of how we use them is where the dialogue gets a little more pointed. But I think that's part of it. I think the survey work that was enabled with the broader question of what is of value to the community is what we have to pay attention to. That fine balance of what can you regenerate, reasonably well, because I do agree that if we lose, it's going to be tight. And thus, my encouragement will be we need to go again as soon as possible. And thus, we won't do it for long. But by approaching it logically with the 10%, 7.5, we are fiscally being responsible that should it go badly, we are on track for keeping the district solid.
And is it safe to, I see you, Tia, let me just ask one follow-up question. Is it safe to say that whether it's 10% or 17.5 over 2 years, that not one of these things is sufficient to get you there, that it needs to be a combination of things, most likely? Or is that correct?
You're correct. Yeah, not one of these is the ultimate problem solver, and they will obviously impact each other.
Right. Tia?
So is 10%, what is 10%? What is that 1.6? Is that the 10%? What's 10%?
1.6.
10% is almost 5.4 million.
5%, okay. Do you know, because I kind of am very with everybody about reducing the targeted reductions. Do we know if, as an estimate, how much that would be of the 10%? Do we have a guesstimate of what that, I guess my thing is to preserve staffing in this 10%. I'm only thinking about the money that, am I allowed to say that we got from standard-ish, right? We have this extra infusion that we right now are paying that we didn't, we allotted it's 3.6 million or something like that, right? Yeah, 3 million that we've allotted to go into this pension plan to rebuild ourselves back. But we have this 11 million that we didn't account for to keep us on track. So my only thing is, for this targeted reduction thing, I would say budget for it, but I want to bring up the option that we actually pull some from that 3 million to keep our staff, if that's the case, because it's still money that's going to staff. And I don't know if that's viable or it just kind of was an idea. So, I mean, I guess it just depends on how much of that. If it's going to be more than 5 million, then I don't want to do that. But if it's going to be like a couple, like a million or something, then potentially.
I want to address that, and I kind of want to go back a higher level, if I may. I think at this point, knowing the direction that you're centered on, seeing options for around a 10% cut, knowing it's important to preserve staffing, that you would like to see, if there are impacts to staffing, more centered through attrition versus staff reductions, that you want to see protections of services that would be harder to scale up, and that you also want to be sure that our reductions on the park services side are short-sighted to the point to cause safety concerns. So kind of knowing those brackets, but knowing the 10% zone, you've given us what we need. And we don't want to get into details because we need to go back and work spreadsheets and come up with scenarios and give you real things to react to. We were trying to look for philosophical direction. You've given us that. And you've also told us your non-negotiables, like what is really important to you. And that honestly is the data we need right now. And then the final thing, Thomas, if I could just say it, is this has been kind of a doggy downer conversation. And I want to lighten us back up a little bit just to remember, one of the things that set us apart, and one of our task force members said, is they were blown away that we were looking at a cliff that was 5 years away and we were preparing now. And we had people in that room who work at other public agencies who said, we wish our public agencies had been thinking this way. We wish we'd had time to react and plan ahead. So I want y'all to hold on to a few things. One, we're ahead of the curve. We've got, sister and brother agencies that were in the middle of the wave and having to make live cuts because they didn't have the foresight that we had to plan ahead. So that's we've got working in our favor. The second thing we have working in our favor is the services that we provide the public. We're doing a pretty good job. They're pretty satisfied. And what the polling tells us is when they're informed and they know the situation, they want to support us. So remember, again, because we're such a deep planning agency, we've got you thinking, if the negative happens, how do we plan for contingency A and contingency B and contingency C? Let's not stay there though, right? Like we're planning, we're preparing, we're doing our good emergency preparedness, plan for those disasters. But our primary plan is to get that levy passed. And we have all the tools in our toolkit for Thomas, thank you, for staff to do an awesome public information campaign. And for our boosters out there and our advocates to help us with their championing on their private time, not on public time. So please stay optimistic that you're working on plan A, B, C, D, E, F for contingencies, but we're in a good position to make our case with the public.
Yes, I'm going to we're doing this at home. I've been in the district in Eastern Oregon. We're fiscally and responsible. So thank you very much, Thomas. I think we're on to our next one. I told you before, just a little over. I knew we'd be at an hour 15 or so. I was right.
Moving on. I just want to echo, I don't experience this as a downer conversation. I hope you don't either. I think it's a wise, thoughtful, strategic, informed, optimistic conversation. So good on you. So, staff, do you have enough direction from the board? Have you gotten enough sense of what they're thinking, what they would prioritize?
I say yes.
All right, great. So, pivoting to an even more positive, forward-looking kind of discussion. The board writ large, this is previous iterations of this board, have, in addition to values, in addition to budget priorities, have really selected several different things that they wanted to focus on or give some particular attention to. And in the recent past, those have included affordable housing and being explicitly supportive of efforts around affordable housing in your service area, strengthening relationships with other elected officials in the area, and a fair amount of time and attention has gone into that, and championing diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. The question that staff have for you is that moving forward, and we're not talking about the levy right now, we're talking about the future. If there were up to 3 things that this board were directing staff to focus on and give particular energy to, what would those 3 things be? Would it continue to be affordable housing, strengthening relationships with elected officials, and championing equity? Would it be one of those 3? Would it be 2 of those 3? And then some other things that have been listed as potential areas of focus would be everything around land advocacy, preservation, acquisition, including Cooper Mountain, but not just Cooper Mountain, not only Cooper Mountain. Would it be a deeper dive and a more explicit dive around climate change and climate resiliency in an amplified way? Would it be kind of the very long-term, long game around annexation of currently unserved areas, unincorporated areas, island areas that are serviceless? Or would it be none of the above? And would it be something else that you as a group identify? So this is deliberately very much forward thinking, not tied to the levy, not tied to 10% and 7.5% budget reductions. So what do you think about that? What do you think about the current 3 areas of focus? And what do you think about swapping any of those out for a different area of focus?
The Rook is gonna hop in here. I like the current 3, but to go a step further, I've been thinking a little bit about the affordable housing and championing DEIA space, and specifically the intersection of climate and energy. And the necessity for us to think about how a lot of the effects of climate change are affecting our communities of color, our immigrant communities, and a lot of our communities that utilize affordable housing. And so as we start to see these warmer summers and weird weather patterns throughout the year, like what are we doing to support systems that can keep shelter for more affordable for folks? And like I've said this before, I think I'm the only renter on the board here. It's tough trying to find spaces for, to be able to have like, it's required that they need to be able to provide air conditioning, but units don't have air conditioning in there for these hot summers and things like that many times. And so what can we do to help the conversation? There's not a lot that we can mandate, but there's a lot that we can advocate for. So I think that is a really big piece as we continue to see the effects of climate change affect our communities.
And Miles, you're also pointing out in your comments the connectivity between all of these issues, affordable housing connected to DEI work, connected to climate change. So what do others of you think? And again, we're not making decisions tonight. We're just beginning a conversation.
Yeah, I like all that. So for me, what comes to mind is I think we should continue to prioritize strengthening relationships with electeds, mostly because for a lot of reasons, it benefits us quite a bit. It serves us both short-term and long-term, so that we can go advocate for things that matter to us that impact our community, so we can go advocate for when we need money. We will have to talk to electeds and hope to influence them around the levy. We will want their very public support. So having ongoing relationships with electeds, I think is critical to our success. I think we've seen the impacts. We are I know they don't call them earmarks anymore, but the fact that Bonamici prioritize us, that's never happened before. That was years in the making, right? So in order to maintain that, like we have to keep at it. So I do think that should be a continued priority for this board. And I understand that there has to be resources for it, for our lobbyists, both in Salem and in DC. So I would hope that would continue. The two I'd sort of maybe add or like evolve on is I would love for us to look at our surplus land, not because it's surplus, but because we're not actively doing something with it. And so where are the opportunities? And I would be so bold as to say we should look at, what does selling mean? And also what does it look like to partner with a friend, an agency, Audubon, affordable housing developers, like what are the opportunities with the surplus land? So I would love for us to have capacity to do that. And then I'd say, with our DEI work, I'd love for us to go deeper and look at disability justice, what that means for us as an organization, as individuals. And that, again, I fully understand all this takes resources. But when I think about opportunities for focus in the future, those are the 3 things that excite me.
I'm gonna hop in again. Sorry, I just thought of another one. Also specifically the work that we do around recognizing our Indigenous communities. One of the things that I think it's cool that like we do like land acknowledgements and things like that. But one of the things I talk about with my own organization is that acknowledgements are great, Their proclamations are awesome, but it does little if there is no action. I know that there is action that we do, but I think just continuing the work of, remembering that the spaces that we take are spaces that were once stolen. And so whatever we can do in our community to keep that in mind when we do programming, or new spaces or renovating old spaces, just thinking about that piece.
Others of you, Tia, Barbie, Alfredo?
I'll jump in here. I'm almost verbatim with Director Monteblanco. In thoughts, I'm very curious to learn more about surplus land. This is something that I will not even pretend to know very much about it, but I think the ability for us to think creatively on how we can leverage that amidst all the other things you said, it would be amazing if some partnerships could happen there in tandem with affordable housing and or other organizations. So I think in addition to thank you for elevating and reminding about relationships as an area in particular of what we own and what our ability to impact can be. So I don't know that I would add more on to the list. I'm separate from, I'm not sure if land advocacy and acquisition falls under surplus, but thank you for raising that.
Tia?
Yes, I agree with continuing to champion our working relationships with elected officials, including, I think we still have work for like the school board and stuff like that, our direct partners that are, and everybody is dealing with budget stuff. So I feel like it's kind of, everyone's trying to keep their house alive. So we haven't been able to as much work together a lot. And the few times that we have are always successful and always elevating for everybody. So I think continuing to focus on that is good. I would love to, for the district and for ourselves, to start really thinking more about climate change and resiliency. I feel like that always gets kind of put on the wayfront, and I think we really need to, as like a Parks and Rec, we need to be like the people who really know that really well. And I think climate change and that, thinking of it from that perspective in terms of what we land acquisition, what plantings we do, what kind of sheltering things we provide, what our rec centers do during hot days and all of that kind of stuff, it all ties together. So really making sure that if and as our planet continues to rise and stuff, that we are as much prepared as possible to be good stewards of the land and to make sure that we are doing our part to hopefully bring down the temperature. So that's a big thing. And then champion DEIA is still a big thing for me. I don't know if champion right word. I want to see like more actionable DEIA rather than like just championing and saying like, to me, that's like, we're just like, way to go, let's try to do this. But I want to see like resulted DEIA and measurable DEIA stuff. So I don't know if there's a wording that we can change for that. Affordable housing, I think we're on a good path for it with the interest rates and all of that kind of stuff. I feel like it's kind of doing whatever it's going to do, and there's not that much that's going to really happen that we can help affect or contribute. So so my three would be the elected officials, DEIA, and focusing on climate and how we get to the next level for DEIA and climate change to be a champion. I don't like that word, but the top people to that we can proudly say like, we're doing it, we know how to do it.
Fredo?
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, affordable housing and, I'll start with affordable housing. I feel like this board, thanks to the groundwork that's been laid before some of us got on, is already very open to those opportunities. And so I think we need to just continue on that path to being open to opportunities for partnership and in that space. Similar to DEIA, I think this board is very baked in, and while you shouldn't necessarily be on autopilot with it, I think as a specific call out, I'm not sure if it needs to be there, but I'll speak a little bit about some other areas that I agree with you that about this board almost doesn't need to champion the EIA as much as be able to show its work and say this is how we've moved the needle. We already champion it in our values. Some of the things, agree with Barton, land advocacy, bullet point number 1, I don't know enough about it, so I need to learn more. I could have some better opinions on there, but I look forward to learning more on what opportunities there are. So that may be a focus, and that it may be something where we all need to increase our depth of knowledge. For me, climate change and resiliency, my mind goes right to maybe the lowering fruit of more accessible water and shade. And so that's where I lean into there on that section. The other thing I wrote down, which Miles kind of touched on as well with Indigenous communities and history, is emphasis of placemaking in Parks and Rec. I absolutely adore what we've done with naming and the protocol that goes into that. I would love to see that extend one layer deeper than the name of the park into actually giving some context in terms of a visual story that is communicated to the public that they can see when they walk in. Perhaps art, things of that nature that really ground the place with that name, with the community that it serves, or the history of the place, history and culture of the place. All of those come back to my point, which I talked about on the budget priorities, which is a huge thought for me these days, would just be the opportunities for diversifying these revenue streams, working closer with the Tualatin Hills Park Foundation as it goes through a transformation right now to really get more oomph into the private funding opportunities from donors, exploring sponsorships and things of that nature to allow us to do all these good kind of evolutionary things that we all value, that the community would like to see us do. Like I said earlier, requires, they often are not cheap or do not cost less money than they did the previous year. So really loves to see what makes sense, what matches with our values, not just taking money from everybody and anybody, but how do we do it in a smart, thoughtful way that deepens the financial bucket and allows us to go after more of those things. So I said a mouthful, Thomas, I'm sorry. Hopefully we can focus on 18 things, right?
Well, two thoughts. One is, the easiest thing to do is just stay the course and add lots of other things to it. The harder thing to do, but the more strategic thing to do, is to really figure out what are the top 2 or 3 things through consensus that you really want to push on and push sufficiently to have an impact and make some sort of measurable, sustainable change, as opposed to kind of dabble in lots of things. And I'm not saying that's what you do, but that is the discipline behind focus. The second thing is, you are not limited to these examples that staff have brought you of things that you might focus on. Some of you are new to this board. Some of you have joined the board after these initial focus areas were determined, and you may come forward with other ideas. So again, you're not making decisions tonight. You're not committing to anything right now, but as you continue the conversation, please don't feel like these are the only options that are available to you. If you have a lot of interest and a lot of passion and a lot of energy around something not on this list, then I would encourage you to put it out on the table and invite your peers to think about it with you. So with that said, it sounds like for now, continuing with DEIA is important yet, not so much championing, but really moving the needle in measurable, significant ways. It sounds like continuing to focus on your working relationships with other electeds and how that's connected to additional revenue and diversifying revenue and recurring support for the levy and lots of other things you want to do. Kind of mixed comments about affordable housing as not as not a value, but just what kind of impact and how much energy needs to go into that as a discrete area of focus. Significant interest in climate change and resiliency, and some significant interest in land advocacy, preservation, and acquisition, with a couple of members saying we need some more information, some more education about particularly surplus land. What is that? What do we do? What are the options? How does that work? How does it not work? Kate, did you have your hand up to say something else?
Well,
Yeah.
with you saying that, I would, to bring up something new and I would love to challenge ourselves to look how we develop our community spaces and how we, and I think it kind of speaks to like rooting into land, or like how our parks are, what kind of parks we're developing. And I know there's a blueprint for them, but how can we do it differently to recognize different peoples, to recognize different cultures, to, you know, to do different ages and those kinds of things, and how we can bring people together and create spaces for people to continuously find a space that they connect to and are welcome to. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be right next to their house. But in that, I would love for the district to start moving towards, you know, as a parent, you don't stick at your own park. You always go for the diversity of things and you go to different things. And I love that. I understand the importance of having a park next to you, but I also have always imagined THPRD of being kind of a destination area where you go and you automatically know there's all these wonderful parks, and you don't have to just go to the closest one, but you can go to the next one and there'll be something completely different and feel different and celebrating something different. And so like, I don't know if that's like a focus that we can do or whatnot, but, and I'm still gonna say again, my 4-season park needs to come somewhere. But just how we develop use our rec centers and how we develop our current already existing stuff, how we're gonna renovate our current stuff, how we plan for the future in taking community vision while also pushing ourselves to be a little bit different than, I don't know how to put that into 2 words, but community spaces, I guess.
Well, again, as you continue the conversation, these are great things to focus on, but please don't feel like you're constrained to just this list. And we invite you to think big and bring whatever is a passion of yours to the table for discussion. So it sounds like we are at a natural close. Does it feel that way to the rest of you?
That's,
It's out there.
do we narrow it down via email? Do you pick 3? Does Doug pick 3?
Great question. So we still have somewhere between 7 and 300 ideas. Should we use, I mean, is that the exercise here, is to keep discussing, or what are
I
we?
guess is this something we're creating lists for staff to bring to us in our work sessions to educate us on? Or are we creating this list because these are the 3 things that us as a board are going to champion and we want staff to focus on? And, you know, like every meeting we're doing this, because like land advocacy, preservation, like I would love that in like a work topic, but is that something I want to champion all year? I just need to know more information for it, right? I don't need us to constantly, like DEIA is something that in relationships with our, you know, fellow electeds, that's something that we'll constantly be working on. So I don't know what we're trying to do right here. Are we trying to give you ideas of work session stuff, or?
If I could jump in here, those examples were not necessarily meant to serve as the amount of distraction as they were. The point of the topic was to say boards change over time. They develop the personality of the people that are on the board. And if you look at like the legacy of an organization, you can kind of see that the focal point and the energy and the interest areas from the board, both as individuals, but also as a collective, have a lot of power, right? And so if you dial back a few years, we had several board members talking about that affordable housing issue. And really, it was a very new notion to the board to say, hey, I know we're a park and rec agency, but we have a role to play in the affordability in the community and whether people can live here or not. So shouldn't we have an active role to play in this topic? And that's how it really opened the door to looking at SDC waivers, looking at partnerships around affordable housing. It really happened on the strength of the board saying, this is an area where we see that we should have a greater role to play. Same thing happened with DEI. Right? We've got board members that are way more into it than boards of the past, which has really moved the needle forward. So this topic was not meant to say, let's come up with a list, let's have staff come up with work sessions. It was really meant to say, over time, boards develop certain agendas, personalities, things that they want to do, how they want to operate. Felicia, I want to give you a lot of credit on the strengthening of relationships with electeds. That's something that you came onto the board talking about with your peers on the board, saying how important it was to develop those relationships. At one point, I think, I don't know if it's still that way, you kind of zoned, right? We talked about which board members are going to be talking to which electeds to making sure that we've got connections going and information flowing. But you had to work collectively together. You had to say this is a focus area. It was something you were doing outside of board meetings. You were tactically figuring out, okay, who's talking to Metro? Who's talking to Beaverton? Who's talking to the school district? Who's talking to the county? So this is what that topic is. You're right. You've done a lot of work on affordable housing. You got that covered. It's humming. What is that thing this year that maybe that topic area, one or two that you all as members of the board collectively want to keep top of mind? Heard a lot about those relationships with electeds and carrying those forward. Have heard a lot about management of land, understanding what our surplus is, understanding what the long-term philosophy, what the opportunities are there. Those are great answers. So just trying to gauge what your personality is among the five of you collectively and where you hope to spend your time and energy and how we can support that almost outside of the stuff we bring you in board meetings, more complementing those efforts. That makes sense.
I also will add that this is a conversation that starts tonight, but it doesn't end tonight. So we are not needing you or asking you right now or in days ahead to take a vote to make this official. If you can do that quickly, great. But we really just presented this as the beginning of conversation. Obviously, at some point, it needs to stop being a conversation and you need to reach some sort of consensus for staff. But we didn't bring it to you tonight for you to narrow it down just to 3 and decide right now. It really was a discussion we wanted to begin. Doug, are you okay with that?
Yes, perfectly fine. I think leave it with Alfredo and I to kind of continue the discussion and figure out what format to bring it back.
Okay.
Can I add early education to this thing also?
That sounds good. And I appreciate everyone's. I've made some jokes, but it's really good that we've heard lots of different things, some of which can, I think, do land in some similar buckets that we can probably hang our hat on. So, yeah.
I really appreciated what you brought up at the last board meeting around public-private partnerships. And I think that ties to the land piece. And I know that how I would have thought about public-private partnerships 6 years ago has really evolved. So I would love if this board got to discuss this.
Thank you. And yes. All right, good, Doug, if that's,
Yeah.
you feel good about that, and we can, no, I think there's some really, exciting things on the table here, and so, guess that's my job to help winnow them down. Thank you, Thomas. I think, yeah. Number
Great.
5.
Well, I want to insert just an editorial comment. So for the board, I just want to share an observation with you. You are really lucky to have the staff you have. And I know you know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I work with lots of organizations on lots of projects and initiatives, and you really are quite lucky and gifted to have who you have. And to the staff, I want you to know that you are really lucky that these 5 people comprise your board. I work with lots of boards, and this is a really thoughtful, kind, considerate, collaborative, strategic board. So I don't say that because you don't know that. I know you know that, but I just want to be on public record pointing out that there is enormous good here. And nothing but good can come of the combination of this board and this staff together, working together. So congratulations, and great things await. I'm certain of it.
I'm telling you, this is the one target. Board of Workers retreat. So I guess I'm gonna go ahead and adjourn this thing. We'll come to the top. Adjourn. All right.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you all. Bye.